On a cool autumn night in the late 1870s, on a lonely rise of stone that would one day be called Como Bluff, the world is very still. The heat of the day has bled away into the open sky, and the only movement is the slow breathing of canvas tents and the faint shimmer of lantern light on pale, exposed bone. Far off, beyond the dark silhouettes of freight cars and telegraph poles, a single train whistle drifts across the Wyoming desert, thin and distant, then gone. The impact of that sound is small, just a quiver in the air, but out here it feels enormous. It is the only reminder that somewhere beyond these low ridges and dry gullies, the modern world of the 19th century is grinding forward with iron wheels and steam. Here, under a dome of sharp, cold stars, men kneel in the dust beside rocks that have been sleeping for 150 million years, their lanterns throwing trembling halos over half-buried vertebrae and the curved shadows of fossil ribs. Near one edge of the bone field, a tent sags slightly under its own weight, canvas darkened by sweat and dust. Inside, Edward Drinkercope turns in his bedroll, not quite awake, not quite at rest. His notebooks are stacked beside him, pages crammed with measurements and hurried sketches, names half invented in the margin. Somewhere beneath the ground, only a few paces away, a scattered skeleton stretches through the rock. The long arc of a tail, the suggestion of a massive shoulder blade. If he can free it, if he can name it first, it would change everything. Across the ridge, in a separate camp marked by a line of picketed horses and a slightly larger tent, Othniel Charles Marsh sleeps just as uneasily. His crew has buried their latest finds beneath loose boards and canvas, trying to hide the shapes from wandering eyes. In his dreams, bones slide from the cliff face in slow motion, vertebra by vertebra, assembling themselves into creatures that stand, breathe, and turn their heads toward him in the lantern glow. The air is full of small, precise details. The smell of horse sweat and tobacco, the dry sweetness of crushed sage under boot soles, the faint metallic tang of tools cooling in the night. Canvas walls inhale and exhale with each passing gust. Loose papers whisper. A coffee pot ticks softly as it sheds the last of its heat into the cooling desert. Around the excavations, the rock has been pared away to reveal pale arcs of ribs emerging from the hillside, curved and regular, like the backs of sleeping giants just beneath the surface of the earth. Take a deep breath and let the modern world fade away. Imagine kneeling beside one of those half-exposed skeletons, your fingers tracing the edge where living bone ended and mineral began, your lantern catching the fine, honeycomb texture of ancient marrow now turned to stone. Somewhere in this maze of quarries and trenches lie the scattered remains of animals that will come to define our image of the age of dinosaurs. The long-necked bulk of Brontosaurus and Diplodocus, the deep-chested strength of Camarasaurus, the plated back of Stegosaurus, the predatory skulls of Allosaurus and Ceratosaurus, the horned armor of Triceratops, the quieter forms of Camptosaurus, and the small, quick Othnielia. Tonight, we are going to ask how a quiet rivalry between two exhausted men staring at the same bones by lantern light could ignite a war of names and accusations that reshaped dinosaur history. This is the story of a conflict waged with picks and notebooks rather than guns, a war fought in whispers, in hurried train shipments, in the careful covering and uncovering of stone. Within a geologic bickering in separate rooms, in separate worlds of thought. In one, a younger man bends over a cluttered desk, lamplight pooling on scattered pages and sketches of vertebrae and ribs. This is Edward Drinkercope. Restless, intense, self-taught in many of the disciplines he needs, he moves his pen with a hurried energy, as if the bones themselves might vanish if he does not name them in time. He copies measurements, adds quick, nervous arrows, and writes Latin names in a tight, slanting hand. Outside, the night is quiet, but inside his head there is only motion, a racing catalogue of every strange rock, every fossil fragment, every whisper of a new dinosaur pressing on the edge of extinction and discovery. Across the years, that separate city from College Town, another light burns more steadily. Othniel Charles Marsh sits in a high-ceilinged office, its shelves lined with neat trays and labelled drawers. Older, heavier in build and intention, he turns a single fossil in his hands and studies it for a long time before he writes a word. Behind him stand Yale, wealthy patrons, and the promise of funds that will move men, rail, and stone. His approach is slower, almost chess-like, each paper a considered move on the board of scientific history, each new dinosaur a piece placed with care where it will block, corner, or quietly overshadow a rival. Between them stretches a continent that is changing. After the Civil War, railroads push westward across Earth's wide interior, iron lines cutting into formations that have been undisturbed for millions of years. As the tracks bite into hillsides and the wind scours fresh cuts in the rock, ranchers and railway workers begin to notice bones, great arcs of petrified rib, teeth the size of a man's finger, vertebrae weathering out of canyon walls. The American West becomes a new fossil frontier, a place where, within a geological instant, the buried past rises to the surface, waiting for whoever reaches it first. At first, Cope and Marsh meet this world together. They visit some of the same quarries, share meals, exchange letters and specimens. There is a brief season when they are almost allies, two men standing at the same crater rim of deep time peering in. Cope, quick to trust, offers Marsh access to his sights. Marsh, quiet and observant, files away what he learns. Then small slights begin to accumulate, misattributed bones, whispered criticisms, a public embarrassment over a misplaced Elasmosaurus skull that Marsh does not hesitate to point out. The friendship cools. It fractures. In its place, a rivalry takes root. Cope vows, not aloud but in the set of his jaw and the furious pace of his writing, that he will name more dinosaurs, fill more pages, leave his mark on the world before the years run out. Marsh answers in his own way, by expanding his network of scouts, by placing quiet claims on quarries, by planning expeditions with the patience of a long game. Both men are driven by curiosity, but also by something sharper, the need not just to discover, but to out-discover the other. It would change everything about how they see each bone. At night, far from the lecture halls and city streets, their separate camps settle under the same vast western sky. Cope lies awake in a thin canvas tent, listening to the wind comb over the Badlands, thinking of unclaimed skeletons sleeping in the rock. Marsh, in a heavier tent not so far away, stares at hum for Cope and Marsh and for those 9 waiting skeletons. But before it does, we need to drift much farther back in time, to a different morning, under a different sky. 66 million years ago, long before notebooks and train tickets and whispered rivalries, another day began on Cretaceous Earth, warm and ordinary, beneath the slow turning of the heavens. High above that ancient world, a rock the size of a city was already falling, locked onto a collision course by gravity and chance. When it struck the shallow seas near what is now Mexico's Yucatan Peninsula, the impact released more energy than 100 million nuclear weapons, gouging a crater more than 90 miles wide into the crust of the planet. Within a geological instant, the shoreline boiled, forests ignited, and shockwaves rippled around the globe. Ash and vaporized rock lifted into the sky, spreading a dark veil through the atmosphere. For days, then months, sunlight thinned and dimmed. The blue of the sky turned heavy and opaque, and photosynthesis faltered. Temperatures fell. Seasons blurred. On land and in the oceans, food webs that had taken tens of millions of years to weave together began to unravel. In that long twilight, 3/4 of all species vanished. The great non-avian dinosaurs, from horned Triceratops to towering Tyrannosaurus, disappeared from the fossil record, along with flying pterosaurs and many ancient marine reptiles. The age of living dinosaurs ended not with a single thunderclap, but with a drawn-out hush, an extinction that silenced most of a world and left only scattered survivors to inherit the quiet. Take a deep breath and let the modern world fade away for a moment. Because even as that catastrophe closed one chapter, it also set the stage for another. Millions of years later, on a cooler Earth now ruled by small, clever mammals, distant descendants of once timid primates would stand on those same rocks, holding shovels and notebooks, and ask what had been lost. Tiny hands would trace the outlines of fossilized ribs and vertebrae, searching for the shapes of vanished giants. This is the story of a different kind of turning point, not written in fire from the sky, but in ink on paper and chisel marks in stone. The asteroid ended the age of dinosaurs as living animals. The Bone Wars would begin the age of dinosaurs in our imagination. We are going to see how two men chasing prestige through the Badlands helped decide which species became classroom posters and museum icons, and which remained anonymous bones in the ground. Here is the quiet surprise. An impact decided who survived, but human rivalry would decide who was remembered. Names like Stegosaurus, Allosaurus, Diplodocus, and the long-shadowed Brontosaurus would rise from quarries and newspapers, while other creatures stayed in the background, their stories half told. Tonight we're going to ask a different question. Instead of following the asteroid through darkness, we will follow 9 skeletons through the hands of 2 rivals, and imagine that on another Earth, where no crater ever formed, their descendants might still be walking under starlight, breathing, feeding, and watching the same slow dawn arrive. So take a deep breath and let the modern world fade away for a moment, because we are going to bend the path of a single rock through space. In our own history, that impact carved a crater and wrote an ending. In this other thread, the asteroid passes just a little higher, a little earlier, its enormous energy spent in deep ocean or empty sky, instead of shallow tropical seas, sail trailing a slow, rippling wake. Along the banks, young trees lean away from its passing, and flocks of small, feathered hunters scatter from the reeds. On higher ground, where old conifers give way to flowering shrubs and open glades, another silhouette moves through fern-rich clearings. Stegosaurus browses there, plates catching the low sun, dew beading along their edges. Each step is unhurried, the swing of its tail measured, as if the years of the Jurassic were still flowing through its muscles. Around its feet, fern fronds uncurl after a night of cool air, releasing the damp, peppery scent of crushed greenery. Farther off, the land breaks into shadowed canyons, their walls banded with red and ochre rock. In those long corridors of dusk, Allosaurus keeps to the broken ledges and pockets of shade, a patient presence among echoing calls and falling stones. It pauses at an overlook, head raised to the wind, testing scents that drift up from the basin floor. Herds moving, water running, distant thunder. Out on the open plains, where ancient floodplains have become grassy basins threaded with streams, horned dinosaurs graze in loose, calm groups. Triceratops lowers its massive head into the grass, shearing stems with quiet efficiency, its frill patterned in muted colours that break its outline against the horizon. Calves doze between the adults, half hidden by seed heads, while dragonflies weave slow, glittering paths above their backs. This is the story of Cope and Marsh's dinosaurs, but softened and made present. In our real history, these 9 creatures came to them as scattered bones, as freight cars full of rock and plaster, as names rushed into print. Yet in this alternate thread, we're going to ask you to step sideways, again and again, into a West where their discoveries never turn to stone, where every skeleton on a museum mount has a living counterpart walking under the same sun. We're going to move gently between those worlds, from dusty 19th century camps and bitter letters, back to river valleys of Brontosaurus, fern-lit clearings of Stegosaurus, shadowed canyons of Allosaurus, and grassy basins of Triceratops. Again and again, the same 9 species will anchor us as we cross that distance, until the line between fossil and living animal feels thin and very fragile, and it would change everything to know which world we're in. To cross that thin line, to move from bone in the ground to animal in the mind, we first have to understand what a fossil really is, not in technical jargon, but in the quiet, patient language of rock and time. Take a deep breath and imagine a young sauropod, a cousin of Brontosaurus, collapsing on the banks of a slow, muddy river 150 million years ago. Scavengers come and go, insects clean the last shreds of flesh. Then the river rises, and in a single season the body is buried beneath silt and sand. Years pass, then thousands of years, then millions. Grain by grain, minerals seep into the buried bones, filling tiny spaces, replacing fragile tissue with quartz and calcite, until the skeleton is no longer bone at all, but stone, locked in place as more layers pile on top. Within a geological instant, mountain ranges lift, rivers carve canyons, and erosion begins to peel those layers back, revealing pale shapes in the cliff face, the ghost of an animal that walked a vanished earth. This is the story of how dinosaurs return to us, not as living creatures, but as patterns in rock that invite interpretation. When paleontologists are of tough, gritty plants, none of it is certain. All of it is guided by comparison. In this work, every reconstruction is a hypothesis, an educated proposal about how bones fit together and how an animal carried its weight through the world. We're going to ask, if the neck bends this far, what does that mean for feeding? If the legs stack straight under the hips, does that imply a steady elephantine walk or a faster, more alert stride? As new fossils appear, as better preserved skeletons emerge from fresh quarries and new methods arrive, those hypotheses are tested, revised, sometimes abandoned. Mistakes are not embarrassments, they are stepping stones. In the late 1800s, when Cope and Marsh were racing each other across the American West, their stepping stones were far fewer. No CT scans to peer inside a skull, no computer models to simulate a running Allosaurus, no chemical analyses to read diet from tooth enamel. They worked with hand-drawn diagrams, plaster, lantern light, and intuition, trying to assemble shattered Brontosaurus necks and Stegosaurus plates into coherent bodies. Their interpretations of our 9 dinosaurs were, by necessity, rough sketches drawn from partial evidence. Throughout this documentary, we're going to set those early visions beside what modern science now suggests, and beside an even stranger mirror, an alternate Earth where no extinction impact ever carved the Chicxulub crater, and descendants of these same lineages still walk under changing skies. Each time we meet Allosaurus or Triceratops, we will pause between the museum mount, the 19th century guess, and the living animal we imagine, and watch knowledge itself evolve. And as the rivalry of Cope and Marsh begins to unfold, with its hurried announcements and quiet triumphs, that evolving knowledge will be our compass, reminding us that beneath every argument lay the same fragile bones, waiting in the rock for someone to listen. This is the story of a sea monster assembled in reverse, and of 2 men who would never quite forgive each other for it. In the early 1860s, long before their rivalry reached its full volcanic energy, Edward Drinker Cope stood before the scattered bones of a marine reptile from the late Cretaceous seas of North America. The skeleton of Allosaurus was not a neat museum mount, but a puzzle of pale stone and broken vertebrae, drawn from the rock of an ancient seaway that once split the continent in 2. Cope, brilliant and impatient, imagined an animal with a powerful tail and a modest neck, a predator sweeping through warm inland waters on a world where dinosaurs still ruled the land. He counted the vertebrae, compared them to what little was known, and made a choice. The small, delicate skull with its sharp teeth went at the end of the long series of bones he took to be the tail. The opposite end, which we now know was the base of an extraordinarily long neck, became the hindquarters. On paper, in lithographs and diagrams, Allosaurus took shape as a short-necked long-tailed dragon, its body reversed, its posture turned end to end. When Othniel Charles Marsh came to see the specimen, he did not protest. He walked the length of the bones, vertebra by vertebra, in a quiet room where the only sound was the soft scrape of boots on the floor and the distant city beyond the windows. Later, studying the drawings, he noticed that the vertebrae near the supposed tail bore the subtle hallmarks of neck bones, that the pattern of joints and processes flowed the wrong way. The animal, he realized, had been built backward. We are going to ask you to take a deep breath here and let the modern world fade away for a moment. In an age before complete plesiosaurs, before careful comparison with living reptiles and birds, the impact was personal. His reconstruction had been wrong, and now the world knew. A bruise formed beneath the surface of professional courtesy. In Marsh, the episode fed a different feeling, a cool sense that he saw more clearly, that his careful eye could catch what Cope's haste had missed. The friendship that had once led them to share quarries and specimens began to tilt ever so slightly toward competition. Resentment on one side, superiority on the other, two trajectories diverging. If a single backward sea monster could do this, if one misread skeleton could bend the course of two lives, what would happen when the bones in question were not obscure ocean reptiles, but the greatest land animals Earth has ever carried, the dinosaurs whose names would echo through history? Those names that would echo through history needed a stage, and the Earth had been preparing one for a very long time. 150 million years before Cope and Marsh traded barbs in print, rivers wandered across a broad, warm basin in the heart of what would one day be called the American West. They laid down sand and mud and silt, layer upon layer, until, within a geological instant, the bodies of drowned sauropods, fallen stegosaurs, and toppled predators were sealed away in rock. This is the story of the Morrison Formation, stretching from New Mexico to Montana, from the red canyons of Utah to the high plains of Wyoming and Colorado. The Morrison is not a single cliff or quarry, but a vast mottled band of late Jurassic sediment, its greens and purples and browns curling under towns, ranches and rail lines. Inside it, long-necked giants such as Diplodocus and Camarasaurus rested beside plated Stegosaurus, early-horned ancestors of Triceratops, and sharp-toothed hunters that would one day be named Allosaurus and Ceratosaurus. For tens of millions of years, wind and rain passed overhead, while these dinosaurs lay in the dark, untouched. The impact that changed their fate was not an asteroid, but iron and steam. In the late 1800s, as the United States pushed west, surveyors traced routes for new railroads, prospectors chipped for coal and silver, and ranchers searched for grazing land. Each cut of a railroad grade, each mine added, each cattle trail gnawed a little deeper into the hills, shaving away the weathered skin of the badlands and revealing the bones beneath. We're going to ask, how many times did a pick meant for coal ring instead against the curve of a fossilized rib? Section gangs and miners began sending word of petrified giant lizards, of vertebrae the size of stove lids and limb bones too heavy for one man to lift. At places such as Como Bluff in Wyoming, where a Union Pacific line nibbled at a low bony ridge, and Garden Park near Cannon City, Colorado, where irrigators and quarrymen worked the slopes, the Morrison Formation came to the surface in generous fossil-rich swaths. It would change everything. Quiet hillsides that had watched 150 million years pass in silence suddenly hosted tent camps, crates, and hurried sketches. Take a deep breath and imagine a slow, wide shot. A freight train crawling eastward at dusk, its cars loaded with rough wooden boxes stenciled fragile, each one packed with Morrison bones bound for Philadelphia and New Haven and New York. Along the line, telegraph poles flicker with messages, thin threads of energy tying lonely quarries to marble lecture halls. Telegrams crackle between field camps and universities. Orders go out, money comes back, and the Badlands become the front lines of a safely remove rather than risk a rival claiming them. In this lonely, wind-scoured landscape the stage was set. The rocks were ready, the railroads were in place, and the first crates were already rolling east. All that remained was for Cope and Marsh to send their armies westward and turn a quiet fossil harvest into the Bone Wars. Out of that quiet harvest turned to war, the first true giant emerged from the crates and dust. In a New Haven laboratory, far from the wind and sun of the American West, Othniel Charles Marsh unwrapped bones so large they seemed almost unreal. Pale rock turned into the architecture of a vanished world. Years earlier, in 1871, Marsh had named a sauropod from a partial skeleton found in the Morrison Formation. He called it Apatosaurus, the deceptive lizard, because the bones did not quite match anything known, hinting at a body only half understood. A few vertebrae, pieces of a pelvis, fragments of limb. Enough to say, here was a long-necked, long-tailed dinosaur, but not enough to feel its full weight. Then, within a geological instant of scientific time, more bones arrived. A larger, more complete sauropod from Como Bluff, Wyoming. Its backbone articulated, its limbs massive and clean. Marsh studied the new skeleton, and whether through haste, pride, or genuine uncertainty, gave it a fresh name. Brontosaurus, the thunder lizard, as if its footsteps alone could shake the ground. He did not bind it tightly to Apatosaurus. He drew a line where there might have been a bridge. Take a deep breath and imagine that skeleton assembled under gaslight. A long pillar-legged body, the forelimbs thick and columnar, the hind limbs bracing a vast barrel-shaped torso, a sweeping neck of stacked vertebrae, each one pierced with hollows where air sacs once lightened the load. A heavy tail stretching behind, not a mere counterweight, but a muscular whip balancing each slow, deliberate step. Now, let the modern world fade away, and let those same bones re-inhabit living flesh in our alternate present. We're going to follow this animal as it moves through a wide, shallow river, water folding around its ankles, skin mottled with algae green and mud brown. Its neck arcs over stands of horsetails and flowering shrubs, head swaying as it strips foliage in long rhythmic bites. Fish scatter from its shadow. Pterosaurs, small and quick, ride the warm air above its back. Later generations of scientists would return to the bones and the names with cooler eyes. They measured vertebrae, counted subtle ridges, compared limb proportions from quarry to quarry. The verdict was unsettling to the public imagination. Marsh's Brontosaurus was probably not a separate giant at all, but another species within Apatosaurus, the older, more obscure name taking priority under the quiet rules of taxonomy. The thunder lizard, it seemed, was legally an imposter. But names have their own energy. Children, museums and illustrators held on to Brontosaurus with a tenderness that no technical correction could erase. This is the story of how the Bone Wars did more than uncover bones. In their rush to publish first, Cope and Marsh created a tangle of duplicate names and near twins, a web of synonyms that later paleontologists would spend years patiently unwinding. We are going to ask, as we follow this gentle giant, what it means for a creature to have more than one name. Brontosaurus, Apatosaurus, thunder lizard, deceptive lizard, all resting on the same, like the serrated silhouette of a buried dragon's back, frozen mid-stride for 150 million years. When Marsh's crews pried those first bones from the hills of Colorado and Wyoming, they did not yet know what they were looking at. Here was a low, barrel-bodied dinosaur, small head, heavy limbs, and along the backbone paired bony plates that seemed to defy easy interpretation. In the early reconstructions, those plates were laid flat, shingles pressed against the spine, a kind of armoured roof that hugged the body. It made Stegosaurus appear squat and burdened, a slow tank of an animal, dragging itself through Jurassic forests with minimal energy and even less grace. Then there was the brain. When Marsh examined the narrow skull and the cavity in the rock where nervous tissue once rested, he estimated its volume at something close to a walnut, and the legend soon shrank it further to a pea-sized brain for a creature the length of a bus. In newspapers and lecture halls, Stegosaurus became a symbol of reptilian stupidity, an almost comical mismatch between body and mind, a living argument, so it seemed, for the inevitability of extinction. To many in that 19th century world, intelligence was measured against the human standard, and anything that fell short was dismissed as primitive. But we're going to ask a quieter question. What if that judgment said more about us than about the dinosaurs? Over the years, as more skeletons came from the ground and as scientists revisited Marsh's mounts, the image began to shift. The plates, with their rich blood vessel impressions, made more sense standing upright in two staggered rows, catching the wind and the light. They may have helped regulate temperature, bleeding excess heat into the air, or they may have been visual signals, turning a herd of Stegosaurus into a slow-moving conversation of colour and outline. The brain, small though it was, looks far more proportional when compared with modern reptiles and birds. Intelligence, in this view, is not a single ladder, but a branching history of solutions. Let the modern world fade away for a moment and follow those solutions into our alternate Earth. Twilight settles over a conifer forest, 150 million years in the past and yet still present, because the great impact never came and no crater ever reset the story. Under the dimming canopy, a small herd of Stegosaurus moves along a fern-lined game trail, their footsteps muffled in damp needles. The plates on their backs stand tall, catching the last low rays, each one edged in muted copper and mossy green, a row of lanterns turned down to a gentle glow. Juveniles keep to the centre, adults flank the sides, and every so often a tail swings, its quartet of spikes, Marsh's thagomizer, though he never used the word, glinting as a quiet warning to any predator watching from the trees. In this living scene, Stegosaurus is neither a blundering mistake nor a half-finished experiment. It is a successful animal, tuned to its world, surviving year after year in the long unbroken continuity that Cope and Marsh only glimpse through scattered bones. Their first sketches, plates flat and brains belittled, were not final verdicts but opening moves, hypotheses etched in ink rather than in stone. Over time, with each new discovery, our picture has softened and sharpened at once, the hard edges of ridicule falling away, the fine details of behaviour and ecology coming into focus. Take a deep breath and notice how this pattern repeats. From Stegosaurus we learn that every fossil is both an answer, the front of a predator's face that had not seen daylight in 150 million years. They followed the jaws back and found more. Neck vertebrae hollowed with air spaces, ribs arcing down toward a deep chest, and, most striking of all, arms that were short but not useless, ending in 3 powerful fingers tipped with hooked claws. This was no sluggish lizard sprawling through Jurassic mud. This was a balanced, muscular hunter, its tail a counterweight, its hips high above the ground. Marsh would call it Allosaurus, the different lizard, and in doing so he pulled a new kind of dinosaur into the public imagination, a Jurassic carnivore that could stand beside the Cretaceous icons that would follow. Take a deep breath and let the modern world fade away. In the quiet of that 19th century field camp under canvas lit by kerosene, the discovery felt electric. The impact of those bones on Marsh's career was immediate. He knew that a big, meat-eating dinosaur could command headlines in a way no obscure herbivore ever would. Cope knew it too. Both men were now racing not just to find bones, but to name the monsters that haunted the Mesozoic night. Then, from rocks of the same Morrison formation, another predator emerged. Its skull was shorter, deeper, crowned by a blade of bone along the snout that rose into a distinct nasal horn. Its body plan was more primitive, with heavier proportions and a long, deep tail, but the teeth told the same story of flesh and tendon sheared from living prey. Marsh named this one Ceratosaurus, the horned lizard, gaining a second dramatic carnivore to parade before the world, another trophy in a war fought with Latin and ink. Here the patent interrupt arrives. For a moment, we're going to step away from the papers and the lectures and walk into the alternate present this film inhabits. Imagine a moonlit canyon on this other Earth, where the asteroid missed and extinction never came. On a gravel bar beside a slow, dark river, a herd of Camptosaurus dozes, their flanks rising and falling, breath steaming faintly in the cool air. Up on the canyon rim, an Allosaurus watches, weight shifting silently from foot to foot, its three-fingered hands flexing as it gauges distance and shadow. Down among the reeds, half hidden by the silvered stalks, a solitary Ceratosaurus moves with a different rhythm, lower to the ground, horn catching a thin line of starlight with each careful step. These are the living descendants of the skeletons Cope and Marsh once argued over, their rivalry echoing now only in museum labels, while the animals themselves continue the older, quieter story of hunter and herd. Early artists working from those first tangled bones often drew Allosaurus and Ceratosaurus with dragging tails and sagging bellies, as if they were half-awakened reptiles, heavy and slow. We're going to ask what it means that our first reconstructions made them drowsy, when the rock record and their bird-like bones speak of speed and balance and alert, forward-leaning lives. This is the story of how our picture of dinosaur energy has slowly come to match the animals that still move through this imagined canyon, and in the next moments we will follow that awakening further toward other giants that rose from the same beds of stone. From those alert, forward-leaning hunters, the rock record leads us back to something slower, and yet in its own way even more improbable. Bodies so long they seem to have been poured across the quarry floor, vertebra after vertebra, a derailed stone train frozen in mid-accident. Sometimes in the very same bone beds, another shape emerged from the dust. Camarasaurus, with vertebrae whose interiors were chambered like tiny cathedrals, carried a shorter, deeper neck, a barrel chest, and a skull that was blunt, heavy, and well-toothed. Where Diplodocus was all span and leverage, Camarasaurus was mass and depth, a feeding tower built to bite tougher branches, to grind rather than strip. Two sauropods, two answers to the same ancient question. How do you turn sunlight and leaves into a moving fortress of flesh? On the ground, in those crowded quarries, the distinction was far from obvious. Ribs crossed ribs, tails snake through the remains of other tails, and Marsh's men were going to spend long hot seasons teasing them apart, penciling neat labels onto plaster jackets, deciding which curves of bone belonged together. Was this robust neck a new species, or only an older individual of a known one? Was that slender tail a juvenile Camarasaurus, or the signature of something else entirely? Each decision carried the promise that it would reshape the world, that one more name in a hurried paper would secure priority before Cope could strike. If we let the modern world fade away for a moment and walk out onto that Jurassic floodplain at dawn, the bones resolve back into breathing herds. Take a deep breath. Mist hangs low over braided channels, and conifers rise in dark ranks beyond. Diplodocus moves in files through the open ground, necks sweeping at one level, scouring soft fronds and low branches. Closer to the gallery forests, Camarasaurus stands more upright, chest deep among young trees, reaching higher, biting through thicker twigs, occasionally rearing to drag down entire crowns. They share the same impact-scarred planet, the same warm, storm-washed world, yet by feeding at different heights, on different textures of plant, they ease the pressure of competition and turn one landscape into multiple layered niches. Across millions of years, what early artists once rendered as a uniform parade of identical brontosaurs reveals itself as a spectrum of designs, each tuned to a slightly different way of being enormous. Cope and Marsh, in their haste, scattered names across this diversity. Some later merged, others vindicated. But beneath the rivalry, the bones were quietly recording ecological nuance. Their long-necked dinosaurs were not a single idea repeated. They were experiments, variations on a theme that would echo forward into every later age of giant herbivores we're going to meet next. For every neck that scraped the canopy, there were quieter lives unfolding beneath. While newspapers in Cope and Marsh's day thrilled over monsters the length of city streets, other skeletons emerged from the same layers of rock, smaller, lighter, and easier to overlook, yet woven just as tightly into the fabric of that ancient world. Camptosaurus was one of these. A medium-sized herbivore, beaked and deep-chested, it could move on two legs when it needed speed, or drop to all fours to browse low shrubs and ferns, its forelimbs sturdy but not ponderous. Its bones lay in the Morrison Formation alongside the titans, Brontosaurus, Diplodocus, Camarasaurus. In museum drawers and quarry ledgers, Camptosaurus appears again and again, a quiet constant where the giants are rare punctuation marks, but its name never carried the same theatrical impact for the public. In Marsh's hands, an even smaller runner took shape on the page. He named it Othnielia, a nod to himself that later generations would revise into Othnumerous. Their herds and flocks consuming enormous amounts of plant matter, cycling nutrients, and feeding the energy needs of carnivores whose fame would eclipse their own. This traces a supporting cast that quietly holds the whole production together, so we're going to step away from the bone quarries and into the alternate present, and let the modern world fade away for a moment. Take a deep breath. Imagine a broad, grassy clearing on a warm evening, in a world where dinosaurs never met their sudden extinction, where the Chicxulub impact was only a distant near miss in orbital history, rather than a crater carved into destiny. In the open, a loose flock of Othnielia grazes, heads down, hands delicately stripping seed heads and tender shoots, tails held level as they drift, and then, with some inaudible cue, dash a few body lengths, freezing again in unison. At the forest edge, a group of Camptosaurus stands taller, hind limbs straightened, necks extended toward the darkening hills. They browse, but between mouthfuls they pause, listening. Their bodies a living early warning system for the smaller runners at their feet. Far away, something roars. The sound is faint, almost swallowed by distance and trees, but every head lifts. For a moment, the clearing is a tableau of stillness. Small ornithopods poised to bolt, medium herbivores weighing the risk, the air thick with the memory of Allosaurus. In deep time, the tension will break, and what steps out of the trees next will redefine who truly rules this ancient grassland. What steps out of the trees is not another predator, but a skull. At least, that is how it will first arrive in human hands, separated from its body by millions of years, carried east by rail, and laid gently on a wooden table beneath the lamps of a late 19th century laboratory, its horns so strange that, for a brief moment, they're blamed on bison. In the rolling badlands of the American West, ranchers had been finding fragments of bone and horn for years, weathering out of pale hills carved by wind and water. One such fragment, a pair of long curved spikes in ancient rock, was sent to Othniel Charles Marsh. At first, even he leaned toward a familiar explanation: the remains of an Ice Age mammal, an enormous prehistoric buffalo that had once roamed this same earth. But the rock told a quieter, deeper story. The bone's texture, the way the horn cores fused with the skull, the age of the surrounding sediments, all whispered Cretaceous, not recent. Slowly the realization dawned that these were not the trophies of a mammal, but the weapons of a dinosaur. Triceratops, three-horned face. This follows one of the last giants. On the table, the skull is almost absurd in its scale, more than 6 feet long, the brow horns sweeping forward in heavy arcs, the nasal horn rising in a blunt pyramid, the frill forming a broad shield of bone. You can imagine Marsh circling it, measuring the massive parrot-like beak, tracing with his fingers the sutures where bone met bone, feeling the latent energy of an animal that had not walked the world for 66 million years. Now step out of the day and let that skull lift as if time were running in reverse. Bone rehydrates, tendons rethread, muscles swell into place. Skin, thick and pebbled, draws over the frame, and suddenly the Triceratops is no longer an object but a presence, standing hip-high to a small tree, its sturdy limbs planted in the soft soil of a late Cretaceous prairie. It moves with a deliberate of dinosaur history. Instead, picture an open, modern landscape. A high plains evening, grasses hissing in the wind, distant thunderheads piling over the horizon. On a low ridge, a herd of Triceratops moves in silhouette, horns and frills etched against the sinking sun. Around their feet, small mammals dart, not as heirs to a vacant world, but as neighbours, sharing the same trails, drinking from the same rivers, keeping a respectful distance from those massive beaks. It would reshape how we understand coexistence. We're going to follow these animals forward into an Earth where dinosaurs never quite surrendered the daylight, and where creatures like Triceratops force us to ask a simple, unsettling question. If they had endured, how would we have learned to live beside them? In the sections to come, this three-horned face will become more than a fossil. It will be a guide to imagining cities, farms and wildlands threaded through with dinosaur paths. A reminder that the story of our world could have been written with very different neighbours at our door. But before we can walk beside those imagined herds, we have to return to the dust and quiet of the 19th century West, to the places where their bones first came to light, and where some were lost again almost as soon as they were found. This concerns a different kind of impact, not a crater gouged into the crust of Earth, but a slow collision between pride, ambition, and fragile rock. In the Badlands of Wyoming and Colorado, Cope's and Marsh's crews worked under open skies and unspoken deadlines, each day haunted by the possibility that the rival camp might be just over the next ridge. The Morrison Formation held the vertebrae of Brontosaurus and Diplodocus, the plates of Stegosaurus, the ribs of Camarasaurus, all resting where they had lain for more than 140 million years. In a brief moment of human time, men with picks, shovels and blasting powder were about to change everything. Reports from those quarries speak in a low, matter-of-fact tone about methods that now feel almost violent. To strip away feet of sandstone overburden, crews sometimes reached for dynamite, packing charges into cracks, lighting fuses, and stepping back as stored chemical energy roared through ancient rock. The explosions would echo across the empty world, dust billowing, shards raining down, and in that chaos bones could shatter as easily as stone. A sauropod limb that had survived extinction and erosion might vanish in a single careless blast. Speed mattered. If word spread that Marsh's men were in the area, Cope's foreman might order the quarry widened in haste, the overlying beds removed in days instead of weeks. We are going to imagine the scene. A half-exposed Allosaurus skull, delicate nasal bones just emerging, when a poorly placed charge collapses a ledge and turns part of the face to powder. No one writes that in the official report. But the fragments remain, ground into the spoil heaps, lost to science and to every future world those dinosaurs might have inspired. And then there were the quieter acts, done not in the glare of noon but in the hush of evening. When a site was nearly exhausted, or when rumours suggested that the other side had hired new scouts, workers sometimes reburied what they could not safely remove. In some accounts, they even destroyed remaining fossils outright, smashing exposed vertebrae and limb shafts, or tipping blocks back into trenches and covering them with clean sediment so that no rival hammer would ever find them. Take a deep breath and let the day soften for a moment. vertebra across 150 million years of history, and in a few minutes the outline is gone. A board goes over the spot. More earth follows. The impact of his decision will never be written down. Some of these tales have been polished by retelling, sharpened by those who wanted the Bone Wars to sound as dramatic as any frontier legend. Yet they reflect a very real atmosphere of secrecy and urgency, an arms race in which information was as valuable as ivory-white bone. In that tense world, the fate of our 9 dinosaurs was not only to be discovered, but to be triaged. Which necks and tails would be saved for shipment east, which skulls would be left, which plates and horns would be broken rather than risk capture. When Cope hurried to publish a new name for Camarasaurus, when Marsh rushed to describe Stegosaurus and Brontosaurus from partial skeletons, they were working not from quiet, complete specimens, but from whatever had survived dynamite, weather, and rivalry. The record they left behind was powerful, but it was also patchy, shaped by blasts, by buried quarries, by choices made under flickering light. And so, as we follow their dinosaurs forward into an unbroken Cenozoic, another question waits at the edge of the next ridge. In all this dust and competition, how much of what they named was truly solid stone? And how much was built on fragments and hurried guesses, balanced precariously on the brink of being revised or erased by the next discovery? The answer for Cope and Marsh was almost always the same: write faster. Put ink to paper before the other man could. In the quiet rooms where their fossils finally came to rest, vertebrae and teeth and shattered limb bones were hurried into Latin, transformed from rock into names, sometimes on the basis of a single fragment that might have belonged to a giant or to a juvenile, to a new dinosaur or to one the world already knew. Take a deep breath and imagine a long sauropod vertebra, hauled from the Morrison Formation, its air sac hollows still packed with ancient mud. In Marsh's hands, such a bone might become a new species of Camarasaurus, declared distinct because its neural spine was a little taller, its proportions a little more elongated. A few ridges here, a slightly different curve there, and the name would be set in print. Years later, quieter eyes would notice that the supposed new species matched the growth of a young Camarasaurus maturing into an adult, that the differences followed a simple curve of age, not a fork in evolution. Diplodocus suffered the same fate. Slender tails and neck bones, some from juveniles, some from adults, some warped by the weight of millions of years of sediment, were split into multiple species, each christened in haste. This is about paper dinosaurs, creatures that lived first as hurried descriptions and grainy engravings, more secure in journals than they ever were in stone. We ask, what does it mean to name an animal that no one has ever seen alive, from bones that may not even belong to one individual? In the rush of the Bone Wars, Allosaurus and Ceratosaurus multiplied on the page, their teeth and limb bones divided into species and subspecies that later work would fold back together. Even the great icons were not spared. Marsh's Triceratops, named from massive skulls, briefly split into several species on the basis of horn length and frill shape, until it became clear that many of those differences were simply growth, injury, or individual variation. Later, paleontologists moved more slowly. They compared whole skeletons of Stegosaurus, Camptosaurus, and the small agile foretail, 3D models of Camarasaurus necks bending under simulated gravity, statistical analyses testing whether two skulls of Triceratops truly differ more than ordinary variation allows. The energy of the work has not changed, but the tools have. Some of Cope and Marsh's creations never existed as distinct species at all, yet their names lingered in textbooks and museum halls, shaping how children imagine the Mesozoic world. We now follow those echoes forward, into an Earth where extinction never came, and ask which of their 9 contested giants would still walk beneath alien constellations of city light, and which would survive only as corrections in the footnotes of a very different dinosaur future. Their echoes did more than shape imagination. They also exposed the cracks in how science, at that time, told its own story. In the 1870s and 1880s, when Cope and Marsh were racing across the young American West, there were few agreed-upon rules. Whoever named a dinosaur first, in whatever hurried journal or newspaper they could reach, usually won. The impact of that freedom was immediate. Names multiplied faster than bones could be cleaned, and with every new skeleton of Stegosaurus or Diplodocus, there was a temptation to declare a brand new species, to carve a personal monument into the deep time of Earth. Everything would shift when those monuments began to wobble. Cope's famous Allosaurus, with its head placed on the wrong end, and Marsh's tangle of sauropod names, from Apatosaurus to Brontosaurus, became quiet warnings. If two of the world's leading experts could misinterpret a skeleton, what else might be wrong? Let's ask gently how a feud between two men helped an entire discipline learn to doubt itself. Over the years that followed, paleontology did something subtle and powerful. It slowed down. Journals started to demand fuller descriptions, clearer illustrations, more careful comparisons before accepting a new name. Other scientists not involved in the discovery were invited to read, to critique, to question. This emerging peer review did not erase mistakes, but it changed their energy. Errors were no longer personal embarrassments to be hidden in a drawer. They were part of a shared process, a way the community felt its way toward the bones of reality. Around the same time, international meetings began to sketch out what would become the zoological code, a kind of quiet treaty about names. To describe a new dinosaur, you now had to anchor it to a specific specimen, to justify how it differed from its relatives, to follow rules about priority and publication. Across millions of years, compared to the long history of Earth, the wild naming chaos of the Bone Wars was being fenced in by agreed standards. The 9 dinosaurs at the heart of this rivalry became test cases for that new discipline of doubt. Brontosaurus was folded into Apatosaurus for decades, then carefully re-examined in the 21st century, with detailed measurements and computer analyses suggesting that, perhaps, Brontosaurus really is distinct after all. Stegosaurus, once reconstructed with too few plates or in the wrong positions, was revisited bone by bone, its double row of plates and spiked tail, the thagomizer, confirmed and refined. Sauropod diversity, from Camarasaurus to Diplodocus, was pruned as some names vanished, merged into sturdier species, while others survived repeated scrutiny. This traces a self-correcting enterprise. Over years, and then generations, bold claims are trimmed, fragile ideas fall away, and the most resilient interpretations remain, resting on the edge of your awareness as the noise of the day begins to fall away. Before we follow them into that alternate Earth, before we watch 9 dinosaurs step out of rock and into a living world, you're invited to pause. If you can, dim the lights around you, or let the screen be the brightest thing in the room, a small, artificial campfire at the end of a long day. Settle your body into a position that does not need to be held or managed, where gravity can do the work and you can simply notice its gentle pull. And now, soften your shoulders in slow and easy, filling the lungs, and let it go out again, even slower, as you drift here for a while at the edges. From here on, this follows a walk. Not a hurried tour through facts and dates, but an unhurried walk through time, through 150 million years of Earth history, where details do not need to be memorized, where names do not need to be recited back. We move through this world the way you might walk a quiet trail at dusk, letting impressions arrive and pass, trusting that whatever lingers is enough. Imagine the air of the late Jurassic, warm and resin-scented, moving in long, slow currents between the trunks of conifers taller than cathedrals. Wind slips through umbrella-shaped crowns, stirring curtains of needle and fern. Somewhere far off, unseen dinosaurs call to one another, low, distant notes that roll across the floodplain like muted thunder. Closer at hand, there is a different sound, the soft rhythmic scrape of brushes over stone in a silent quarry, human hands teasing bone from rock, grain by grain, year after year. In that quiet, it is perfectly acceptable to drift. Attention can rise and fall, like breath. You may hear every word tracing each impact, each crater, each twist in Cope and Marsh's rivalry, or you may feel your awareness loosening, dipping in and out of the story. Both are welcome. The narrative will continue to flow, a slow current beneath you, whether you're fully awake or already half asleep, hovering in that threshold where images and thoughts begin to blend. We now ask something unusual of this history. From this point forward, we will follow each of the 9 dinosaurs that Cope and Marsh fought over, not only as skeletons in museum halls, but as living presences in a world where extinction never came. Brontosaurus and Diplodocus will move again through fern meadows. Stegosaurus will turn its plated back to the Jurassic sun. Allosaurus will stalk the tree shadows with measured predatory energy. It would shift everything to see them not as relics, but as neighbours in an alternate present. Here is the small pattern break. This will not be a dream without anchors. At every step we will be guided by what science suggests they could have been. Their lungs, their muscles, the climates they knew, yet experienced at the pace of rest. As you breathe, as you sink a little deeper into stillness, the next part of our walk begins. 9 giants, leaving the quarry behind, stepping softly into a living earth that kept on turning. So step out of the day for a moment, and step with those 9 giants into one more place that never was and yet could have been. The quarry dust settles behind us, the echo of pickaxes and shouted measurements dissolving, and in its place another sound rises, the slow, rhythmic hush of water moving through a broad river valley under a sky crowded with stars. It is night on this alternate Earth, not in the Jurassic, not in the Morrison Formation of Marsh's field notes, but in the present day, tens of millions of years feet against gravity, through a lattice of air sac-filled vertebrae to a skull that nuzzles at high branches and then dips, almost lazily, to rake soft aquatic plants from the shallows. Each beat is a quiet act of defiance against height. They do not move alone. This concerns a herd, but not a tight panicked cluster. Paleontology suggests sauropods travelled in loose social groups, and so here, under the constellations, they spread along the river like slow-moving islands, adults at the periphery, subadults weaving between, smaller juveniles closer to the safer inner paths. They follow memory more than sight, tracing routes used for years, perhaps generations, the way elephants in our world remember hidden waterholes. Around them, the ecosystem has learned their weight. Riverbanks are buttressed by deep, tangled root systems, trees that grow at the favoured browsing height where thicker, tougher bark, an evolutionary investment against centuries of scraping teeth. Grasses rebound quickly where their columnar feet have passed. Smaller animals, mammals with reflective eyes, feathered theropods in the reeds, time their crossings to the slow pulse of the giant's approach and departure, slipping through the wake of safety that follows such overwhelming presence. Humans live here too, but at a distance measured in respect rather than in miles. Protected corridors follow the river's bends, mapped not for roads, but for the habitual paths of the river walkers. Raised platforms stand back from the water, dark and quiet, where people come at night to watch without intruding, to listen to the infrasonic murmurs that roll between the animals and vibrate faintly in the chest. In this world, children learn that these dinosaurs are older than cities, older than writing, older than their own species' history by tens of millions of years. From a few vertebrae, a pelvis, the massive limb bones Marsh once wrestled from western rock, we now infer all of this. The high browsing, the powerful heart, the social spacing along the floodplain. In deep time, those bones left the cratered quarries of the Bone Wars and entered museums. Here, they never had to leave the river at all. As you let your breath slow and follow their silhouettes downstream, another question waits in the darkness ahead. If these calm giants endured, what sharper, hungrier shapes learn to move in their shadow? You follow those silhouettes until the river thins into shadow, and the floodplain rises into forest, and for a moment it feels as if the world itself is holding its breath. The last light of a cool evening pools between trunks of beech and maple, and as you let the day soften, another shape moves there, slow and deliberate where no living eye has seen it for tens of millions of years. A Stegosaurus steps between the trees, then another, then a small loosely gathered herd, their backs a procession of tall plates that catch the dusk like stained glass half buried in armour. Let's walk with them for a while. Each footfall presses damp leaf litter, crushing fern fronds and the stray seedling of a modern oak, the weight of Jurassic history settling gently into a 21st century forest. In the fading light, the plates look heavy and rock-like, but within them, life moves. Modern research, tracing fine channels in fossil bone and comparing them to the sails of living reptiles and the wattles of birds, has revealed a dense web of blood vessels inside each plate, a vascular network that once pulsed with warm, dark energy. This is about skin and circulation wrapped around stone, a system that could bleed heat into the air when the day ran hot, or hold it in when the night grew cold. We'll ask what those plans is ignored. To these dinosaurs, the small mammals of our modern Earth are background noise, the rustling static of a world they still dominate. Every so often, one Stegosaurus lifts its head, tiny brain held high on a long neck, plates flushing slightly as it listens to some distant sound we cannot hear. Somewhere, Marsh's original Stegosaurus waits in the wings of history, short-backed, low-plated, spikes misplaced, a creature half-imagined from shattered bones. His early reconstructions would be startled by this scene, by the way the plates tower and glow, by the quiet social spacing of the herd, yet the clues were always there, locked in the fossils he fought so hard to claim. In a flash of geological time, later scientists turned those clues into a truer animal, one that can now step softly through our imagined forest. And beyond the last line of trees, where the undergrowth thins and the air cools further, something else steps as well, in no hurry at all. It watches the herd with patient eyes, as its ancestors did 150 million years ago, waiting for one plate shadow to falter at the edge of the clearing. The watcher in the shadows is not a cat, and not a bear, and not anything the modern world ever prepared us for. High above the valley floor, on a narrow ribbon of rock that catches the moonlight like a blade, an Allosaurus stands motionless, every line of its body carved in silver and black. Breathe out slowly and settle in for a moment. The canyon below is a maze of broken ledges and talus, the remnants of ancient rivers that cut down through Jurassic sediments, long before there were cities, before there were roads, before there were dreams of extinction and impact and craters on distant worlds. A cold wind combs the scrub and sparse conifers, carrying scents upward, musk of grazing mammals, iron of distant water, the dry dust of crumbling rock. The Allosaurus does not rush. Its eyes, large and forward-facing, adjust to the faint pale light. This traces an old hunter in a new world, and let's ask how its ancient anatomy writes its behaviour across millions of years. A strong muscular neck holds the heavy skull steady, ready to swing with sudden whip-like energy. The jaws, not a vice built for crushing bone in a single decisive impact, but a flexible slashing apparatus, open and close in small rehearsal movements, tongue-tasting the air. Modern reconstructions show the teeth as steak knives rather than chisels, the arms short but not useless, ending in three-fingered grasping hands. In this imagined night, those hands are not decorative relics. They brace against a struggling flank, rake along fur and hide, help the jaws maintain purchase as the neck hammers down again and again. We watch, in slow motion, an ambush hunter that kills by accumulation, A first surprise charge from the shadows, a flurry of slashes, then withdrawal, letting blood loss and shock finish what no single bite was built to do. On this alternate Earth, where dinosaurs never yielded the crown, Allosaurus has not vanished into history. It has adapted. In some ranges it shares territory with big cats that favour speed on open ground, and with bears that dominate riverbanks and berry-rich thickets. The dinosaur rules the broken country. Steep canyons, dense conifer stands, places where a 6-ton body can vanish behind one bend and reappear with terrifying precision. Deer-sized mammals fall most often, but now and then a bison, or some horned descendant of ancient ungulates, goes still under a pale moon. Their bone wars carved the name into science. This world, if it had happened, would give it back to the animal. Somewhere beyond the canyon, another shape moves through the dark, taller, slower, carrying something more than claws and teeth. And as the Allosaurus lifts its head to listen, the path of dinosaur history bends toward a possibility even stranger than survival. That taller, slower shape resolves, not into a predator, but into a walking piece of horizon. A pillar-legged sauropod, its neck sweeping forward like a living bridge between earth and sky, moving with a patience that makes the night itself feel young. Dawn comes, and we'll drift here for a moment and stand at the edge of a vast, warm savanna. Grasses ripple in slow waves, scattered trees lift flat crowns into the hazy air, and along the far side of a shallow river, a line of diplodocus is on the move. Dozens of them, nose to tail, their necks held low and level, form a second horizon beneath the clouds, an undulating band of bone and muscle that seems to redraw the skyline with every step. Closer in, among clusters of taller trees, Camarasaurus herds browse at a different height, their necks shorter and more upright, their bodies compact and barrel-chested, reaching into the mid-canopy where the leaves are tougher and more shaded. This is about 2 ways to be a giant herbivore, sharing the same open world, partitioning the sky into feeding layers the way fish partition a coral reef. It would reshape how a landscape breathes. Each sweep of a diplodocus neck strips branches bare many feet off the ground, leaving clean linear galleries where sunlight pours through. Camarasaurus, rearing slightly, knocks down heavier limbs, breaking wood with a slow, cracking percussion that echoes over years into the architecture of the forest. Under their feet, tons of weight press tracks into the soil, trampling winding corridors through grass and saplings, compacting some patches into hard, dusty avenues, while opening others into light-filled clearings where fast-growing plants take hold. Plant communities respond, trees that can re-sprout after being pruned, shrubs that tolerate being crushed and broken, grasses with deep roots and high silica content flourish along the habitual paths of the herds. Insects concentrate at this shifting edge between shade and open ground, feeding on wounded bark, fallen leaves, and dinosaur dung, turning waste into a constant humming cloud of wings. Here, a pattern interrupt. The sky is not ruled by pterosaurs now, but by familiar modern birds. Flocks of starlings, grackles, and parrot-bright descendants of Cretaceous lineages trail the herds, diving and wheeling through the air behind every footfall. They snap up insects launched into panicked flight by the passage of each massive foot, riding the turbulent energy of displaced air the way seabirds ride the bow wave of a ship. Some nest in trees repeatedly pruned by sauropod mouths, where the foliage is dense but the inner branches are kept open, a living architecture co-designed by beak and tooth. Human structures, in this world, must bow to these older engineers. Bridges span rivers with foundations sunk deeper, their decks reinforced for the occasional, irresistible crossing of a multi-ton body. Overpasses rise higher to clear the sweep of a diplodocus neck. Power lines run in buried conduits or on towers spaced to allow a sauropod to pass beneath without brushing steel. In rural regions, painted signs mark wide, gently sloping underpasses as sauropod crossings, where the law and common sense agree that not only with birds and shy mammals, but with clever, tool-using predators of a very different kind. So we let the dust of those ancient quarries settle, and we follow the timeline forward, until the rivals' fossils are no longer bones in museum drawers, but living bodies moving through a very different world. This concerns small dinosaurs at the edges of human cities, of quiet footsteps where concrete meets grass. Let your breath slow, and imagine an ordinary spring morning on the fringe of a modern town, the hour when the streetlights are still on but the sky's fading from black to blue. Along a narrow green belt that threads between cul-de-sacs, a group of Othnielia stirs, feathered backs beaded with dew, dark eyes catching the first hint of light. They move cautiously along the park edge, hugging the line of shrubs and low trees, pausing whenever a distant engine turns over. Their beaked mouths crop at tender shoots and the tips of ornamental bushes, snipping with the precision of garden shears. Each body is light and narrow, built around strong hind legs and a stiffened tail, the same basic plan Marsh pulled from Jurassic Rock, now translated into living motion. At the slightest clatter, a trash bin lid, a barking dog, their bodies coil and release, energy flashing through muscle and tendon as they sprint in a blur, weaving between benches and picnic tables, vanishing into the deeper shadows beneath a pedestrian bridge. Let's ask how long it would take for such scenes to become ordinary. Years, perhaps decades, until the town's residents learn that the hedges will be nibbled if left unprotected, that footprints with 3 narrow toes will appear in the mud after rain. Children might leave out chopped vegetables the way others feed birds, watching the little herbivores dart in and out, half tame and always ready to bolt. Farther out, beyond the subdivisions and ring roads, the land opens into larger reserves, places where the city's noise thins to a low distant hum. Here, in broad meadows ringed by conifers and scrub oak, Camptosaurus herds graze under a sky streaked with jet trails. Their skulls carry broader, heavier beaks than their smaller cousins, well suited to cropping tough grasses and low branches. Their forelimbs can brace against the ground as they feed, yet powerful hind legs still hold the memory of faster, more nervous ancestors. Distant towers shimmer on the horizon, a glass and steel skyline rising behind these plant-eating bodies, whose lineage survived the impact that once nearly ended them. In terms of Earth's long history, they have gone from dominating fern plains to grazing within sight of freeway overpasses and wind turbines. It would reshape how we picture cities, to have dinosaurs as part of the background noise of daily life. Over years, they would become symbols as much as neighbours. Stylized Camptosaurus silhouettes on city flags, Othnielia mascots painted on school gym floors, yet also names muttered in annoyance when garden beds are clipped to stubble overnight. To live with them would be to accept that the boundary between wild and domestic is porous, that the old age of reptiles never truly yielded. Let the modern world fade away for a moment and hold that image of small dinosaurs at the margins of human light. Because if Othnielia can slip through our green belts and Camptosaurus can graze just beyond our suburbs, what happens on a foggy morning when an entire Triceratops herd decides to cross a highway? On that foggy morning, the highway does not roar. It hums, a subdued ribbon of motion, held at bay by fences and flashing amber lights, while on the other side of the barrier, an older traffic moves at the pace of muscle and brack as horn tips brush and test one another. Modern anatomy guides the scene. Ceratopsian skulls with their huge muscle scars and expanded frills suggest powerful necks and complex visual displays, more parade ground than battlefield. Horns that once were cast as weapons of constant combat now read as signals, billboards of bone advertising age, health and rank. We'll ask, in a world where predators still watch from the tree line, how often can they really afford to lock horns hard enough to break? More often, the big males simply angle their frills, swing their heads, and let the message carry. In the corridor, that message plays out in small, almost ceremonial motions. Two bulls step a little apart from the main flow, 4 feet planted, tails stiff. They tilt their skulls, frills catching the pale light, horns crossing with a hollow tap rather than a crash. Calves, shaded under the arch of their mothers' necks, peek out between forelimbs, absorbing the language of posture and distance that will govern their lives for decades. Communities have bent around this ancient choreography. Seasonal road closures are posted months in advance, bright electronic signs counting down to calving season, when the herds become more nervous and more determined, and when a single frightened charge could turn a car to folded metal. Warning placards show the outline of 3 horns and a flared frill, universal symbols now, as familiar as a deer crossing. Quiet viewing platforms stand back from the fence, sound dampened, with low red lighting so that you, standing there in the cool air, can watch without becoming a source of stress. Breathe out slowly and step out of the day for a moment as those silhouettes move past, indifferent to your presence yet reshaping your sense of time. To see them is to feel the impact of deep history made flesh. For more than 66 million years on our Earth, Triceratops existed only as rock and memory, their extinction written in shattered bone and buried sediment. In our real world, Marsh's first Triceratops skull was just a broken face from the Badlands, a puzzle of horn cores and fused bone that he named from a desk thousands of miles away. Here, in a flash of geological time, that stone mask has unfolded into whole herds, their daily migrations cutting broad, pale scars through modern grasslands, their grazing patterns deciding where shrubs grow and where they fail. It would reshape how we understand conservation, because protecting them would mean protecting corridors that span entire continents, and protecting those corridors would mean admitting that our roads and cities are temporary guests in a much older story. And yet, as the herd reaches the point where the corridor must cross the highway, where concrete dives beneath a broad, dimly lit underpass built just for them, another shape waits in the shadows, feathers catching the light in broken bands. If Triceratops has reclaimed the fence line, who is watching from beneath the overpass, and what happens when horns meet eyes built for the hunt? It is not Allosaurus that waits beneath the overpass. Far from the highway, far from the concrete and the sodium lamps, dawn is lifting over a marshy river delta, and another watcher holds still in the reeds. Mist clings to the water in low, silver veils. In the half-light, only a narrow ridge of nasal horn and the faint outline of 2 eyes break the surface, dark against the pale reflection of the sky. This traces Ceratosaurus in the modern world, a survivor between worlds, half river and half shore. Soften your shoulders and let the day soften for a moment. We follow the slow rhythm of its breathing, the tiny ripples that spread from its flanks, the quiet patience of a predator that does not need to chase thrust. In this alternate Earth, that anatomy finds a new niche. Where Allosaurus haunts the open woodlands and the rocky uplands, Ceratosaurus sinks into the wetlands, hunting in channels and oxbow lakes, hugging the margins where mud, water and forest interlock. We now ask what happens when a land predator leans into the water, not fully aquatic, not truly terrestrial, but balanced on the threshold. It would reshape how, and how often, we see it. Most humans, in this world, never do. They know Ceratosaurus the way many people now know tigers or snow leopards, through motion-triggered cameras, through night vision footage of a horned silhouette gliding past, through a single frame of jaws closing around a struggling lungfish in green-tinted infrared. A quiet splash on a camping trip, a line of broad, 3-toed tracks emerging from one pool and vanishing into another. A V-shaped wake on a windless morning, written on the surface of still water and gone across millions of years. The animal itself becomes almost mythical, a rumour in the reeds, a name on warning signs at the edge of protected deltas. Parents tell children to stay away from the deep channels at dusk, pointing to the faded photograph of a horned head half seen between cattails. More than a century ago, when Othniel Charles Marsh first described Ceratosaurus nasicornis, he called it, quite simply, a horned lizard, emphasizing that strange nasal crest and the row of osteoderms running down its back. Even in the chaos of the Bone Wars, amid crates of shattered rock and hurried papers, he recognized that this dinosaur did not quite fit the pattern. Its story hinted at a different way to be a large predator, even if its full lifestyle remained speculative, reconstructed from fragments in sandstone rather than from ripples on living water. In both timelines, ours and this imagined one, Ceratosaurus never fully steps into the light. Its bones lie in quarries and museum drawers. Its living body, in this alternate present, slides between reeds and disappears into tannin-dark pools. So much of dinosaur history is like this, half seen and inferred, a presence we know through traces, through impact and absence rather than through direct encounter. And as we watch the horn sink beneath the surface, leaving only widening circles on the delta's skin, we're reminded that most lives in deep time, no matter how large, pass us by as whispers rather than as roars. So let the ripples on that tannin-dark pool widen and fade, and imagine that when they vanish, something else in history softens with them. Imagine that the sharp words over Allosaurus, the public humiliation, and the wounded pride still happen, but that what follows bends in a different direction. The impact of that moment is real. The crater in Cope's ego is deep. Yet in this quieter world, we watch what happens if, instead of a feud, a fragile alliance takes root. In this gentler timeline, the two men still pace the same lecture halls, still pore over the same slabs of ancient rock, but after the argument they do not turn away. They meet again, perhaps in a museum gallery under the hollow gaze of a fossil skull, and they agree that the West is vast, the years are short, and the dinosaurs will outlast their tempers. They decide to share field reports, to trade maps of Como Bluff and the Morrison Formation, to divide promising ridges rather than poach them. Joint expeditions move out across the high plains. The same winds blow dust over the bones of Brontosaurus and Diplodocus, but now a single coordinated camp rises beside bird-hipped dinosaurs. Fewer duplicate names appear in print, because Marsh and Cope compare notes before publishing, arguing in letters instead of in headlines. Yet something is missing. Without the fierce pressure to outdiscover the other, the tempo of naming slows. There is no frantic cascade of over 130 species, no dizzying parade of new creatures announced year after year to a fascinated public. The newspapers still report on dinosaurs, but the energy is lower, the drama muted, and perhaps fewer children in that century dream under gaslight of skeletons rearing over them in marble halls. Competition, even when it cuts, can pull new worlds into view in deep time. So this follows a balance that science is still learning to strike. Too much rivalry, and priorities twist, evidence is damaged, and extinction's traces are lost. Too little, and curiosity drifts. Discoveries arrive more slowly, and the world stays smaller than it might be. Modern paleontology, shaped by the real scars of the Bone Wars, tries to walk the narrow path between those extremes, with open data, shared quarries, and international teams spreading out across Earth. Let your breath slow, settle in for a moment, and hold that lesson as we follow these 9 dinosaurs forward into the alternate future where their bones are never the end of their story at all. So now, as the dust of the Bone Wars settles in our imagination, we now walk back past each of the 9 dinosaurs that Cope and Marsh dragged from the rock, and ask what remained when the shouting stopped. This concerns what endured, what was gently corrected, and how those early bones still shape the way the modern world pictures deep time. Brontosaurus, or Apatosaurus, came first in that parade of giants. Marsh was right about the broad outline, an immense long-necked herbivore with pillar legs and a whiptail, a living bridge between ground and treetop. The corrections came later, as neck posture shifted from swamp-dwelling dragger to high-reaching walker, and the famous Brontosaurus name itself was demoted. Then, with the arrival of new data, partly restored by modern taxonomic work, Stegosaurus, with its double row of plates, was always a walking paradox. Marsh saw an armoured plant-eater, slow and low, and that ecological role still holds. But the plates he once imagined as flat shields were rotated upright, rearranged, and reinterpreted as display and thermal windows, while the tiny brain he mocked no longer stands for stupidity, only for a different kind of nervous system. Allosaurus arrived as a classic predator, and that has not changed. The skull, the claws, the deep chest all still speak of a top carnivore. What shifted were the details of posture and motion. The tail lifted, the body balanced in a horizontal line, the arms less slashing, more grappling, the energy of the animal redistributed along a more bird-like frame. Diplodocus and Camarasaurus anchored the other end of the herbivore spectrum. Cope and Marsh grasped their sheer scale, and the division of labour between slender, whip-like browsers and heavier, deep-bodied feeders. Modern work pulled them from the water, elevated their necks into flexible, air-sac-laced columns, and refined which plants they could strip in a single sweep. Ceratosaurus, with its nasal horn and blade-toothed jaws, stayed a mid-sized hunter in our reconstructions, but lost the dragging tail and sprawling gait of early mounts. Triceratops kept its role as a living bulldozer of the late Cretaceous, but gained a more dynamic stance, a mobile frill, and a complex not as skeletons under glass but as living presences. If they had never faced extinction at that distant crater, how would it feel to sense them moving through your own world, just beyond the edge of sleep? And what would let's see when we follow them into that alternate Earth? So we'll follow them now, not as names on yellowed paper or bones in a museum hall, but as quiet weights on the living Earth, and we ask your attention to drift with them. Soften your shoulders and step out of the day until it is only a distant ripple, far below the slow, steady tide of deep time. Imagine you are high above a Jurassic floodplain, suspended in the warm evening air, the impact and the crater that never were already long forgotten by this world. Below the land is a green, breathing sea, and into that sea the long backs of Diplodocus, Camarasaurus and Brontosaurus rise and fall, islands of muscle and bone moving with tidal patience. Their necks sway in slow arcs through veils of fern fronds and conifer branches, each step pressing a soft memory into the wet ground, each exhale a pale mist that vanishes across millions of years. The light tilts, you glide forward, the floodplain unfolding beneath you as one long, continuous sentence of water and leaf and skin. Ahead, the green thickens into forest, and there Stegosaurus stands among the trunks, its plates catching the low sun so that every edge glows, a quiet row of ember-coloured sails. Tail spikes rest, not striking, merely balanced in the air, as if the animal itself has forgotten that they are weapons and remembers only their weight. Farther on, the land opens into a narrow canyon. Sand lies damp and undisturbed, a pale ribbon between darker rock. Allosaurus and Ceratosaurus have passed here, but they do not shatter the silence, they only crease it. Their three-toed tracks are faint hollows, already softening at the edges, as if the earth is gently erasing each step as soon as it is made. Their bodies are gone around the bend, their energy folded back into the dusk, and the canyon returns to stillness almost before you notice the disturbance. Without warning, the forest thins, and the pattern changes. Below you, open grasslands roll away under a cooler sky, blades whispering in long, synchronized waves. Here, Camptosaurus and small, quick Othnielia graze near the low lights of human settlements, their shadows brushing against fences, their movements small and rhythmic, rising and falling with the same calm tempo as your own breath. This is about two histories touching without colliding, the long age of dinosaurs and the brief age of people sharing a single field at twilight. You circle wider now, crossing a ridge and descending toward a vast basin. In its centre, under a sky crowded with patient stars, Triceratops herds rest in a loose ring, adults on the outside, juveniles drowsing safely in the middle. Horns tilt toward the dark, Frills form a low wall of bone and silhouette, and the night presses in, gentle and immense. Those same stars once watched Cope and Marsh brush rock from fossil bone. They watched the bone wars flare and fade, then watched new scientists rewrite the story, again and again. Let the details blur at the edges. Let names and dates, rivalries and revisions soften and sink back into the sediment of memory. What remains is a feeling of continuity, one long, gentle arc from the first dusty bones in a western quarry to this if you're only half awake. That is perfectly all right. You do not need to remember every name, every crater, every quarrel. You have simply been keeping company with 9 dinosaurs and 2 stubborn paleontologists, letting the modern world fade away for a while, and that is enough. Thank you for lending this hour of your night to an alternate story of Earth, for drifting with us through deep time while the ordinary concerns of the day soften at the edges. You might, if you feel awake enough, leave a few quiet words behind you in the comments, the way a diplodocus tail might trace a line through Cretaceous dust. Perhaps you could share where on this planet you're listening from, which corner of the world is holding you while you drift through these fossil beds. Or you could mention which of the 9 dinosaurs feels most vivid in your mind. The armoured plates of Stegosaurus, the 3-horned silhouette of Triceratops, or the long-necked silhouettes that Cope and Marsh raced to name first. In that way, a scattered audience becomes a gentle, global late-night conversation. But you do not have to. You can answer now or later, or not at all. This traces worlds that never were, and it will still be here when you return, waiting patiently in deep time for you to step back into the grasslands and galleries of bones. When the next restless night comes, we now be here again, ready to walk beside you through other extinct worlds, other scientific feuds, other alternate Earths where one small change in an ancient impact would change everything, and the dinosaurs, and you, keep moving quietly through the dark. So now, as the grasslands dim and the galleries of bones grow quiet, the story turns back to the 2 men who chased those bones across the young American West, leaving their own small crater in the history of science. Edward Drinker Cope and Othniel Charles Marsh, 2 names that can feel more like opposing forces than human beings, 2 points of impact whose shockwaves still ripple through every museum hall. This follows 2 boys who grew into rivals, each carrying the weight of where he came from. Cope, the Quaker prodigy with restless energy, publishing papers for years before most students finished their lessons. Marsh, the cautious New Englander, lifted from poverty by a wealthy uncle, trained in Europe, shaped by institutions and expectations. They were not caricatures of greed or malice. They were men who woke up each morning with the same thought. Somewhere out there, under rock and dust, the dinosaurs were waiting. We'll ask you for a moment to see them not as feuding headlines, but as tired figures by lantern light. Cope bending over a jumble of vertebrae, rushing to assemble Allosaurus, and, in his haste, putting the head on the wrong end. Marsh hearing about it, feeling both the thrill and the sting of advantage, and then choosing to make that error public, to turn a mistake into a weapon. These were years of backward reconstructions, of hurried names for Brontosaurus and Apatosaurus, of personal letters turned into printed attacks. Yet under the pettiness lay a relentless labour that is easy to overlook. Imagine the effort it took to send teams into the Morrison Formation, into Como Bluff, across a world with no satellite maps, no instant messages, only trains and wagons and hope. Fossils were blasted from cliffs, hauled for miles, catalogued by hand. Marsh's Stegosaurus plates, Cope's Camarasaurus bones, the towering frames of Diplodocus and Allosaurus, emerging slowly from rock that had held them for more than 140 million years. Their feud, for all its broken friendships and buried bones, opened a door simply to be imagined. We leave Cope and Marsh here, surrounded by their crowded drawers and towering mounts, with their victories incomplete and their errors still being gently corrected by later hands. Our understanding of these bones is always unfinished. There is beauty in that incompleteness, because it leaves room for better data, and for gentler dreams, and for one more possibility about what those 9 dinosaurs might have become if one ancient impact had gone just a little differently. Our understanding is unfinished, and that is part of why it can be so gentle to rest inside. This concerns bones and deep time, but it is also, quietly, the story of why long, slow histories can cradle a tired mind at the end of a day. When the brain is awake and alert, it is scanning for impact and threat, running through lists, rehearsing conversations, replaying old scenes. It is busy solving problems that belong to the modern world. Yet when let's follow a predictable, low-stakes story about rocks and dinosaurs and forests that vanished millions of years ago, something begins to shift. The events are too far away to demand action. No decision is needed. The mind can stop planning and simply drift from one image to the next. Imagine the way a scene in the Morrison Formation unfolds. A sandstone cliff, a half-buried vertebra, a slow brush revealing the curve of a fossil rib. Nothing urgent happens. Years pass between discoveries. The outcome cannot hurt or help you now. In that gentle certainty, the brain finds permission to loosen its grip, because every turn in the story arrives with low energy and high predictability. A tailbone here, a skull there, a name argued over, and then corrected in a flash of geological time. There is also the comfort of scale. We now ask what it feels like to let 150 million years of Earth's history roll past behind your closed eyes. When Cope and Marsh quarrel over a neck bone or the name of a sauropod, their anger is a brief flicker against a background of continents moving, seas rising and falling, forests growing and turning to coal. Set against that kind of time, the worries that circle a human evening can start to feel smaller, more manageable, as if they too will weather and erode like a crater softening under wind and rain. Here is the pattern: interrupt. None of this needs your full attention. In most stories, losing the thread is a problem. Here, it is the point, the steady rhythm of description. Rocks, bones, distant rivers, slow-moving herbivores, a patient predator watching from the shade, can act almost like a lullaby for the thinking mind. There is always another fern, another footprint, another layer of mudstone to follow, so it does not matter which details you keep and which you let slip away. If your attention has wandered, that is natural. If you have already fallen asleep once and woken again to find the story in a different place, that is natural too. This narrative is designed to be safe to lose, a path through deep time where every missed step simply sets you down in another quiet clearing. So, breathe out slowly and settle in for a moment for a little longer. As we move toward the closing moments of this journey, you're invited to do less and less, to let the remaining words wash over you without effort, while the dinosaurs of Cope and Marsh recede into the dark, still walking through their endless Cretaceous night. So now, in this quieter clearing, we'll walk back through the 9 names that Cope and Marsh carved into the stone of our shared imagination. The 9 dinosaurs whose shadows still move through the halls of museums and through the corridors of the mind. Its spine a patient horizon against heat-shimmered grasslands. Camarasaurus moves among thicker woods, pressing its rounded skull between trunks, breathing resin and fern spores, its footsteps muffled by needles and fallen leaves. Ceratosaurus waits in the reeds at the edge of a marshy channel, horn catching a faint glint, tail tracing slow arcs through the dark water as insects stitch rings on the surface. Triceratops stands at the fence line of our cultural memory, that wide frill and 3 horns facing an invisible frontier, as if it has wandered up to the boundary between their vanished Cretaceous and our electric asphalt world. Camptosaurus grazes in open meadows, small herds moving through waist-high plants, heads lifting now and then to watch the wind. and Othnielia, light and quick, runs through an even stranger landscape, reimagined into city parks in the present day, darting between benches and trees, a tiny survivor in the gardens of skyscrapers. Each of these scenes rests on real rock, vertebrae measured with calipers, limb bones weighed and compared, tooth marks traced and catalogued. But each scene also floats on layers of imagination and culture, on paintings in children's books, on museum murals, on the private images that form when you close your eyes and drift here for a while. This is about how bones become stories, and how stories become companions. The Bone Wars decided which companions would be loudest. In a single moment of human history, the rivalry between Cope and Marsh turned some dinosaurs into household names and left others buried in specialist papers, shaping the cast that populates our dreams. Brontosaurus on lunchboxes, Stegosaurus on classroom walls, Triceratops facing down Tyrannosaurus in 1,000 imagined battles that never happened, yet feel inevitable. Tonight, we ask a gentler question. Which of these 9 feels most at home in your own inner landscape? As you drift deeper, you can let one of them fall into step beside you. A quiet presence from another age, pacing you towards sleep, while the others fade back into the dark, still waiting in the rock for someone else to imagine them awake. So now, as that chosen dinosaur keeps pace beside you in the dark, we now let the roar of the Bone Wars fade, and listen instead to what remained when the shouting stopped. Breathe out slowly, and step out of the day for a moment, until the only sounds are wind, distant thunder, and the quiet crumble of old rock under an empty sky. Years after Cope and Marsh were gone, the quarries at Como Bluff and Garden Park lay still. The gangs of workers had packed up their shovels and chisels, the rails that once carried crates of bone down the slopes had been torn out, and the last echo of dynamite had long since rolled away across the high plains. Rain softened the sharp edges of wagon ruts, snow filled old boot prints, and the scars in the sandstone and shale faded, until only a trained eye could read those cuts in the earth as the shadows of a frantic age. In the low light of evening, you could walk those ridges and see only faint ledges where bone beds had been, small tailless fans where spoil heaps once stood, a stray nail or rusted can half swallowed by lichen. This traces a landscape that absorbed an impact of human energy, then slowly healed. The way a crater on Earth softens under millions of years of rain and root and frost. The dinosaurs waited there for tens of millions of years before the feud. They waited. Allosaurus and Diplodocus stretched from gallery to gallery. Stegosaurus raised its plated back in frozen defiance. Allosaurus leaned forever towards some vanished prey, while Triceratops, Ceratosaurus, Camptosaurus, Camarasaurus, and the small, quick Othnielia held their poses in a strange, bone-white stillness. Private rivalry became public wonder. Children craned their necks. Gas lamps and early electric bulbs cast long ribcage shadows across marble floors. With each passing decade, the names Cope and Marsh slipped a little further down the plaques, then into the fine print of monographs, then into footnotes. New scientists remeasured the bones, renamed species, corrected mistakes. New storytellers stood beneath those same skeletons and imagined how these dinosaurs might have moved, breathed, and survived in worlds before and after extinction. Across millions of years, the feud that had once consumed 2 lives became just one more layer in the sediment of scientific history. And through it all, the rocks remained patient. They had outlasted the arguments, the dynamite blasts, the hurried misidentifications, and they will outlast us as well. Yet even now, there are ledges at Como Bluff, gullies in Garden Park, and unassuming cuts in distant Badlands where bone still waits in the dark, untouched. What happens when someone, years from now, follows those faint scars and peels back one more thin sheet of stone? What happens when someone years from now follows those faint scars and peels back one more thin sheet of stone? In a sense, that someone is already here. Not in the quarry, not under the sun and wind, but here in the quiet, listening, while the world outside your walls continues on without you for a while. For a moment, imagine time as a single line stretched across a dark room. At one end, far behind you, the age of dinosaurs runs on and on, Jurassic forests steaming with breath, Morrison mud drying around the ribs of Camarasaurus and Diplodocus, the patient armour of Stegosaurus buried under ash and sand. At the other end, far ahead, there is only an unknown distance, a future Earth that no one has walked yet. And somewhere in between, so small it could be covered by a fingertip, is you. It can feel strange to see yourself that way, a tiny mark between impact and extinction, between Cope and Marsh arguing over broken rock, and whatever comes after our own era has ended. Yet there is a quiet comfort in it. Many storms have risen and passed already, volcanic winters, shifting continents, entire oceans opening and closing across millions of years. Many more will come and go after the worries of this week, this day, this hour have faded into the sediment of memory. Soften your shoulders. Let the modern world fade away for a while. The messages, the headlines, the small urgencies of the present can sit on the surface while you drift a little deeper toward the slow currents that shape this planet over millions of years. Seen from that depth, even the loudest moments of human history become gentle ripples on a very old sea. Let's ask something unusual now. Not to remember a date, or a name, or which dinosaur had which plates or horns, but to notice the simple fact that you are here, listening, at the edge of deep time. This follows Cope and Marsh, of Brontosaurus and Triceratops and all the rest, but it is also the story of a mind reaching backward with care, using imagination as a bridge across 60, 80, 100 million years. Once walked where those streets now run, that long before this moment, and long after, Earth continues its slow rotation under the same sky. Notice how your body feels as that thought settles. Any remaining tension can sink down through you, the way dust settles in a quarry after the last hammer blow, after the last shouted instruction, when the workers have gone and only the rock remains. Muscles around the eyes, the jaw, the shoulders can loosen, as if they too were laid gently into sediment. The breath moves in and out without effort, carving no crater, disturbing nothing, just passing through. In a few moments, let's leave the quarrels of the bone wars behind and follow the bones themselves, forward along that line into the museums and minds they transformed. For now, you can rest at this quiet midpoint in the timeline, a small point on a very long line, with eons behind you and all the open future ahead. So we'll leave that line on the page and step instead onto a quieter line, a path of packed earth winding through a Jurassic forest under a cooling sky. Ferns lean in on either side, cycads stand like patient sentries, and above, conifers knit their branches into a dark, sheltering roof, the last light of the day dripping through in thin, amber threads that catch in the mist. For a moment, there is only this ancient world and the faint, steady impact of distant footsteps. Let your breath slow and let the day soften. The air here is heavy, warm, touched by resin and river silt, carrying the low, musical calls of dinosaurs far off between the trees. Somewhere, a sauropod shifts its weight, a slow creak of tendons and bone. Somewhere else, a small ornithopod splashes through a shallow channel and then is still. The soundscape is wide but gentle, the energy of life spread out over miles of forest and millions of years. As you walk, the path opens onto a clearing, and in the far distance, half veiled by hanging fronds and drifting mist, a Brontosaurus moves. This concerns a neck so long it seems to bridge horizons, a body that turns with tidal patience, a tail that draws a quiet arc through the air. It pauses, head lifting, as if to acknowledge your passing, then slowly angles away. each step a soft, delayed tremor through the ground, fading as it melts back into shadow. Further on, the forest thickens again. Between the trunks, plates catch the last glimmer of light. Stegosaurus, standing almost motionless, its array of tall, leaf-shaped plates rimmed with a faint glow. For a heartbeat, it is a silhouette of angles and curves, ancient armour against forgotten threats. Then it too turns, the heavy thud of its tail a single punctuation mark in the undergrowth, before it disappears into the gathering dark. High on a low ridge, Allosaurus watches. Just a pale outline of skull and rib, a hunter at rest, it tracks your movement with a slow rotation of the head, teeth briefly outlined in silvered dusk. For a moment, you're going to ask whether it will follow, whether the story of pursuit and impact is about to begin again. It does not. It simply steps back 1, 2, 3 strides and vanishes beyond the crest, leaving only the memory of its presence. One by one, along the narrowing path, the others appear at the margins of vision. Diplodocus, a distant river of vertebrae sliding between trunks. Camarasaurus, deeper odd claws. They are a slow, even rhythm, almost a heartbeat, almost the sound of breathing before sleep. In deep time, the Jurassic trees around you begin to blur and change. Conifers soften into familiar pines and spruces, ferns give way to brambles and undergrowth you might brush past on a modern trail, and the air cools, trading resin and river mud for damp soil and fallen leaves. Dinosaur calls recede beyond hearing, replaced by crickets, a distant owl, perhaps the far-off rush of cars that no longer matter. You're still walking, but the world has become your own night. Now, let the path itself dissolve, each step becoming smaller, slower, until there is no more forward motion at all, only the sense of lying down in a place that holds you. The ground becomes a bed, the forest canopy a ceiling, the last traces of impact and crater and extinction, air dust sifting away from your thoughts. The weight of the day lifts gently, as if brushed off by the passing tales of giants who have already forgiven and forgotten. If dreams come, they may carry fragments, the curve of a plate, the sweep of a horn, a long neck mirrored in a quiet ancient river. They may bring back a ridge with a watching hunter, or the hush of a museum hall where bones rest under soft lights. There is no need to hold on to any of it. You can let each image arrive, shimmer for a moment, and then slide away, the way the dinosaurs slid back into the dark along that forest path, leaving you alone with your breathing, your heartbeat, and the deep, slow turning of earth beneath you. And in that darkness, in that quiet space where even the last dinosaur footstep has faded, there is nothing you need to hold on to at all. The Bone Wars, with all their noise and impact, with dynamite and accusations and hurried names etched into the history of science, can soften now into a distant echo, no sharper than a breath. This is about 2 men and 9 dinosaurs, of Brontosaurus and Stegosaurus, of Allosaurus and Triceratops, of long-necked Diplodocus and Camarasaurus, of Ceratosaurus, Camptosaurus, and the small, quick Othnielia, all drawn into a rivalry that once crackled with energy. Tonight, that crackle has burned itself out. The quarry lamps are dim. The last train car of rock has rolled away into the dark. If you're still awake, thank you for travelling through that world, through those years of dust and argument and discovery, all the way from the first misread bones to the quiet museum halls where these dinosaurs now rest. And if you slipped beneath the surface long ago, if you only heard fragments of names and the soft murmur of a distant crater, that is perfectly all right. This journey was here for you whether you followed every word or slept through the middle of the story. Any night you wish, we be here again. You can return to this trail of bones and letters and lantern light, to the silhouettes of long necks against a Cretaceous sky, or you can wander into other paths on this channel, through alternate Earths, where extinction never came, or through different corners of deep time where other histories unfolded in deep time. When you're ready, you can explore new impacts, new worlds, new quiet what-ifs. But for now, there is nothing you need to do, no choices to make, no actions to take. You can settle in for a moment, let unanswered messages and unfinished tasks drift to the edge of awareness, as distant as Cope and Marsh themselves, as distant as the first bone lifted from the rock. Breathe out slowly, slow and easy, and feel the weight of your body